South Africa's come a long way over the last 30 years, but the collective experience of apartheid and its legacy have left deep-seated wounds. As we commemorate Human Rights Day, we look at how they manifest in and affect us. There is a significant body of research into intergenerational trauma and collective trauma, which inquired as to whether apartheid-era stress manifests itself in the children of survivors decades earlier. And did they contribute to mental health issues? Let's talk about the psyche of our nation and the historical influence on our well-being with the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union, Professor Saths Cooper. Prof, good morning. Happy Human Rights Day. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The findings, Prof, in one study found that greater prenatal stress then was not directly associated with mental health prevalence in a child in general. But here's what's interesting. It did find that children who were born to younger mothers who at that time were subjected to high levels of abuse or fears of being jailed showed a higher prevalence of mental illness. What's your perspective on the concept of collective and intergenerational trauma?
I think this is one of the terrible gaps in our current body of research, one, and two, that our policymakers haven't considered the enormous impact on our well-being, our state of mind, our engagement, our ability to effectively take full advantage of those human rights that are braided and which we are supposed to celebrate today. It's important to recognize that our brutal past and poorly managed current policies have inflicted such deep wounds on our psyche that they perpetuate cycles of fear, anger, despair, desperation, and frustration. For many, the trauma of our past persists in the form of a complex post-traumatic stress syndrome. There's ongoing, my view is there's ongoing psychic emergency. I know, experiencing it, growing up and constantly experiencing it, but pushing it back to the nether regions of our mind. Depression as a result, anxiety, and other psychological challenges on a persistent bed of poverty all around us. Poverty of income and leadership. So the gap, the intergenerational, the lack of serious knowledge of intergenerational transmission of these symptoms, if you like, without mediation. They have not been mediated in any way, continue and ensures their perpetuation. They shape the behavior of all of us. Most of our children are socialized by the told and untold stories of suffering. And our children, our future, and remember that at least 60% of our population is under 30 years of age, they bear the mantle of those psychological scars embedded deeply in everything that we do and every living moment. That widens the them and us divide across society. It's made worse by the silly season of hundreds of political parties promising us everything while effectively seeking it only for themselves and not for the majority of people. We need to actually confront that past with courage and compassion in order that we can create a future where the human rights that we are supposed to be celebrating are upheld. Psychological health and well-being are grounded, and so that all of us, without regard to rich, poor, black, white, male, female, throughout the country, may fully embrace our common humanity.
Yeah. Prof, what you've shared with us is a sermon in and of itself, and it bears listening to again and again. You've encapsulated so well and with such depth and empathy as well. What you're sharing creates the picture of us as a society in our democratic post-apartheid phase as the walking wounded. I'm going to come back to how we confront the past, and I also want to circle back to your very personal experience. But you touched on this, and I want to go deeper. How does racism and systemic oppression affect how we respond and in some ways deepen the wounding and the paralysis?
You know, as a result of the Sharpeville massacre, and the research now says that those numbers are higher than that put out of 69 people killed for peacefully protesting. As a result of that, there was a turning point in our entire struggle, because in May of 1960, both the ANC and PAC were banned and went into exile. The rest is history. As a result of Sharpeville, Langa, and other places of brutality, on the 21st of March 1960, the United Nations Day for the elimination of racial discrimination was adopted was actually adopted by the General Assembly in 1968. That's a year before the Convention on Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid was seriously started to be looked at. So there is that nexus. However, in our democracy, we have all sorts of Chapter 9 institutions. We almost want to hide or deny the phalanx of racism that our children now bear, and that is so brittle that you don't even have to scratch, it'll all pour out. So we don't confront the worst thing that has happened in this country, and that's blatant, naked racism that was used to control us in many ways, our minds, our bodies, because we could not, if you were 16 and you were African, 80% of the population is African, you would be summarily arrested if you didn't have a pass. I recall very distinctly, I was a 14, 15-year-old, and there were two burly blackjacks. You know, in Durban we used to call municipal police who were African blackjacks because they had a black uniform. They chased a little boy, shorter than I was, but probably of the same age, and he was against the fence and they were pummeling him. I went up to the scene and said, "Stop what you're doing. Why are you beating him up?" And they actually stopped. They turned to me and said, "Do you know this fellow?" And I said, "No, but he's about my age. And you are doing something. You are black people doing it to a child. Why are you beating him up? You are enforcing past laws that our white minority government has in place." They stopped. He was bleeding. I gave him my handkerchief to wipe off the blood, and a sergeant walks up from the Kwela that was parked around the corner, and he said, "What business have you with this boy? Do you know him?" And I said, "No." And I repeated what I said to the two policemen. He said very calmly, "You've made your point, now move on, or we will arrest you for interfering in our duties." The boy gave me returned the handkerchief. It was full of blood. I said, "No, keep it, you need it." From that day, I've never carried a handkerchief. So, I mean, these things affect us. The situation in Dube, the hostels that have been refurbished without really anybody thinking of engaging with people. How do we eliminate the scar on our urban landscape where there were dormitory situations? Some still exist, we know, in the reef, the land of gold, and that kind of thing. Section 10 was a feared section because if you were a repeat offender, you would be enthralled to that farmer who kept you as a literal slave for at least 10 years. So we don't confront these kinds of things. And we just say, "Oh, well, it's, let's celebrate human rights." We don't look at the gravity of that. It's decimated families. It's created a lot of intergenerational violence and perpetuation of it because the persons responsible are no more around. We turn this violence on ourselves. And finally, I'd like to repeat what you started with, and that is the role of apartheid oppression on our health has not been researched appropriately. And it impacts all of us, you and I, and everyone else that has to put up with our inability to mediate our environment.
Prof, I want to end with, and again, we wish we could have had a really expansive conversation on this, because all of the areas that you touch behove us really to act in the present. As you say, a number of these institutions, or just our collective behavior, seems to be one of denial when people are still suffering with so many of the things that we protested about during apartheid, chief among them racism. When you think about restorative justice, reparations, are these actions that should be able to address some of the emotional and other deficits that we experience in society? Now, how well, honestly, did we as a country do on those scores?
Hopelessly. We have not acknowledged the role that our history has played on our lives. We've also taken to toadying with former oppressors. Many of them are leading members of most of the parties. And the historic complicity we have not dealt with. You know, I remember asking commissioners in the TRC, when are you going to consider the files of those people who worked with the apartheid system and all the other stuff they did against us? And the response was, it will open a can of worms. Well, I'm afraid the worms are amongst us right now. And we have a plethora of parties contesting elections in just over 2 months, and none of them seriously is saying, let's deal with our past. Because if we don't, and you know, I sound like a cracked record because I was saying this in the early 80s after I came out of Robben Island, talking about intervention, the violence that confronted us. Then we were followed by so-called black-on-black violence with Askaris, with people working who were from amongst us, but now we're actively working with the system. So I think that we need to hold those who want our votes to, one, transform, redress the huge gaps that shockingly exist in our democracy, and that these wannabe parliamentarians truly serve the needs and interests of all our people, not just help themselves to becoming an instant millionaire by going to parliament. Two, actively strive for social justice. Impose the policies that deny the majority of our people access to material and psychological conditions necessary for optimal human development, and that they stand up and advocate violations of basic human rights. For crying out loud, we've got Chapter 9 institutions. All of them deserve to resign because they have not seriously intervened. They'll all come up and tell us, I've done this, we've done that, we've done this, etc. But they truly have not confronted racism, its impact on our society. And on this day is the United Nations Day for the elimination of racial discrimination, adopted directly after Sharpeville. It took a few years, of course, formally adopted in 1969. We don't talk about it. I think our leadership is so terrified of the racists and those who still represent that the media call some of these civil society groups, for crying out loud. These are representatives of the worst of the past, trying to justify their issues. And I can say that in the worst period of torture that I experienced, I understood in 1974, beginning of 1975, these burly guys beating the hell out of me. They were more terrified of the ideas we stood for, and their fear was, will you not do to us what we have done to you for all these decades from colonialism into apartheid? We've not turned the tables on them. Yet some of them scream to high heaven all sorts of murder and mayhem. They are responsible for the state of affairs. Our current dispensation, our NPA has not pursued actively these cases, and thankfully there is a report which says certain people need to be prosecuted. Unfortunately, we'll prosecute an empty dock because many of those people have died. The torturers, the frontline soldiers for the apartheid system are no more with us.
Prof, you've opened, the tin can of our, the cadaver of our past, it would seem, and so much that you've said really must give us cause for pause when you talk about not dealing with historic complicity, when you say that these Chapter 9 institutions are ineffectual. I think what is constructive for us to do in our next conversation is bring them around the table and test what you're saying against what they will say in dealing with some of the skeletons from our past and some of the ghosts that continue to haunt our society. We appreciate your time and your perspective. Professor Saths Cooper, who is the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union.